Hello. This is Yasunobu Sato, a professor of University of Tokyo for this class. I invited Dr. Sanders, Gerard Sanders, who is now a special assistant to the AIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and he was working as a general counsel, but he just promoted to this special position. And now, due to this COVID-19, he is currently in Rome, Italy. And then, unfortunately, he couldn't come to enter Japan for this COVID-19's prohibition of new entry. And then we just arranged the emergency exceptional for this online course. So just I introduce Gerald to you. He will introduce himself and then guide you how to conduct this special course. I'm very honored and very much excited to have him as a visiting professor, as I was working with him a long time ago, I think 1995 to 97 in London as a General Counsel's office as a colleague. Myself was the council of this EBR, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So Gerard was kindly worked with me for several ambitious missions in the bank. So since then, we continue some friendship and invited him even 2 years ago already. He and his colleague also gave us a special seminar in Hongo, our graduate program of the public policy, so on. So now I will just declare the opening of this course officially. Thank you very much. So Gerald, can you come in and it's your floor?
Thank you very much, Professor Sato. That's very kind words. Indeed, we've known each other for a very long time. I think for at least 25 years.
Yeah.
We were working together.
Time flies.
I think we were both very young when we started. That's all we
Still
can
young.
say. That's all we'll say to the students. Thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you to the university generally. It's a great honor to be providing this series of lectures to such a prestigious and famous university, clearly one of the leading universities in the world. So it's a great honor to be associated with your great enterprise. And thank you very much for all the students who have joined. I know they had a choice. They didn't have to choose this particular series of lectures. So it's fantastic that you've all joined, and thank you very much for doing that. Let me thank also the assistants at the University of Tokyo who have made this series possible, in particular Haruki Matsui, Yurie Takeuchi, and in anticipation of her help going forward, also Lauren Power. And I would thank to Yumi and Yoshia for their help also. We are going to be joined during much of this series by my colleague from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Dr. Gao. Dr. Gao is going to be especially active during the seminars, and I'm grateful to him for contributing. He knows a great deal about public international law, especially, so he's quite an expert in this field. So I'm grateful that he is participating. He is also going to be joining us for some of the lectures, and I think you'll see him quite active in the chat function that we have on Zoom. And let me also thank my colleagues at the AIB who have assisted in the preparation of the slides that you have seen. That's Graziella Base and also Ranjini Ramakrishnan. So I'm grateful to them. So it seems like the Academy Awards, so I think I've thanked everybody except my mother, but I appreciate all the work that others have put in, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Let me just say a few other procedural issues before we launch into the lecture proper in terms of the organization. So as you will be aware, this is a credit course. This will run over 4 weeks for the remainder throughout February. We'll have lectures on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there'll be a seminar on the Fridays, and each of them will be for 90 minutes, and we'll just run straight through with them. So as you know, we're working through Zoom. So you have your lectures. We don't have them attached to the screen, but I will occasionally refer to them, and they are page numbered. So please look out for that. I should say though that the materials that have been distributed are more in the way of enriching the materials that you can access in order to understand the subject of the course better. So I won't be following them slavishly, but I hope that nonetheless they are useful for you. Then I should also add, and I know this is important from when I was a student, that the mode for examination has been settled, and we will be looking at a combination of participation. So just turning up already helps. Presentation and an essay, and the essay will account for 50% of the grade. The essay is due by the 23rd of February. It should be between 1,200 and 1,500 words, and it should be, it'll be on a subject which hopefully you find of interest, which is covered by this particular course. I'll give you more information about it at a subsequent lecture, probably next week. And finally, let me say that I do very much encourage participation. So what I would suggest is if you have a question, or even if you have a comment or an observation, then please write it down in chat, share it with everyone. And I will look at these periodically, and I know Dr. Gao will be monitoring them, and he will offer some observations and some answers on substantive questions. So please don't be shy in doing that. And I'll also invite some answers or some suggestions for people to speak orally from time to time. So please don't be shy. So let me perhaps say a few words about the purpose of the course and why I think it's worthwhile us exploring this subject together. The idea of this course is to give people an introduction to the world of international financial institutions or multilateral financial institutions. I'm aware that some of the students have a law background, some of them have an international relations background, and others have a background from a different discipline. So I will try and pitch the lectures at a level where no one will be handicapped if they don't have a particular background. But I hope that at the end of this course, then all those who have participated will have a better understanding of international financial institutions, what they are, what the purpose is, how they come into being, who owns and controls them, what are the governance arrangements around international financial institutions, what is the law, and what are the rules, that govern these institutions and what is the contribution that they make to development. So this is the purpose of the course, to give you to give an introduction to those who the subject is new, and to provide a refresher for those who are more familiar with it, and for those who have some expertise. And I know that there are some who have some deep expertise in this area. Hopefully, the course will still be useful in terms of providing some additional insights and some new materials for you to consider. Now, I think that this is a worthwhile subject to study for a number of reasons. The first is that studying multilateral financial institutions is important because of the relevance to development. So there was a time when much development financing was provided by international organizations. Today, they only provide a small fraction of development financing. So most development financing is provided by bilateral financial institutions, and they're often pursuing objectives that have been set by their own regulators, by their own states. So if you look at the bilateral agencies of any government, then the purpose is to advance the interests of those governments, often the foreign affairs interest, often their particular perspective on development. The two are frequently related, but it's sometimes the case that there is a clear distinction between the foreign affairs objectives of a state and the development objectives of the state. But the reason that bilateral support is provided is that it's possible for the state to prioritize support. So, for example, if you come from my home country of New Zealand, then there is quite a distinction between pursuing the foreign objectives of the state and supporting development. There's a recognition that development is important for the world, and therefore the country would like to be part of that initiative. However, the bilateral agencies are important because this is a way of being able to concentrate support in areas and geographic areas in particular that are especially relevant to the country. So in the case of New Zealand, it's very important to be able to support the development objectives of the Pacific Islands. So on a different scale, you see that elsewhere in China, there's a vast amount of development support that is provided by the agencies of the state. And those agencies are responsible for building a massive amount of infrastructure, for example. But the objectives, the choices that are made in terms of what to finance and how to finance things reflect the preferences of the state. In the case of multilateral financial institutions, this is all a little bit different. And multilateral financial institutions are owned by a large number of members, usually, and there are different standards. There's not national standards, but there are international standards that are being applied. And there are objectives that have been set that meet the needs of the membership as a whole. And it's not any domestic law relating to procurement or environmental and social standards that apply. It's rather the standards that the international organizations think are appropriate. So I think that if you study multilateral financial institutions, it enables you to get an insight into how development is financed by different kind of financiers, whether they are multilateral or bilateral. Another reason that this is a worthy subject of study is that I think that just by looking at a number of the issues that we will touch on, one can get a fuller appreciation of the kind of issues that are relevant to the development debate. So if you're interested in development, then by studying international financial institutions, you can get a deeper insight into development issues. A third reason for studying multilateral financial institutions is that it's a sort of focused way in which one can learn more about international organizations generally. So there are many more international organizations that are not international financial institutions than there are that are international financial institutions. And so they're very well known. The United Nations is probably the best known, but there are many of them, including specialized agencies of the United Nations and others as well. So you can think about organizations such as the World Health Organization or the World Trade Organization. So all of these organizations have a real impact on development, and they have a broader impact as well, but they're not really financing development. But by studying multilateral financial institutions, you can learn much more about international organizations, because multilateral financial institutions are a subset of international organizations. All multilateral financial institutions are international organizations. And the final reason for following this course is that when we give examples or when we try and focus on particular issues, we'll often do this with reference to the most recent multilateral financial institution to have been created, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is the institution that both I and Dr. Gao are from. Between us, we have a broader perspective that we can offer. So I've been the General Counsel of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is the UN specialized agency. And I've also been for many years at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, most recently as Deputy General Counsel. Dr. Gao has worked at all of those institutions, and he's also worked at another international organization as well. So we can provide a broader perspective on the subject, but we would like to focus a little bit on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because by doing that, we can observe those things that seem to be established and seem to work well, which the AIIB has built on. So there's a very important element of continuity that you can see here. And then you can also look at those areas that are innovative, those things that the AIIB does, or the way in which it's organized, or the way in which it's funded and so forth, that are different from the other institutions. So by looking at the AIIB, because it's the most recent organization, we can understand international financial institutions generally and international organizations more broadly in a more appreciative way. So for all those reasons, I think that this is a subject that is worthy of study. So before I proceed further, I just wanted to pause for a few minutes and ask the students to reflect on what it is that they would like to get out of this course. Why is it that they have chosen to study this? Rather than providing oral questions, maybe I ask you to think about this for a minute or two, and then to jot down some answers in the chat box. Don't worry about, don't spend too much time on this, just be honest and share your views. And I'm sure this is not part of what it is that we publish, but this is useful for me so that going forward I can tailor my lectures a little bit towards what the specific needs of the students are. So again, please just spend a moment or two now just thinking about why you are studying this course. What would you like to learn from this? So with that, I will be quiet for a few minutes and ask everybody to think about this subject. So let me encourage those who have not yet provided comments to provide them. So remember, we're looking for full participation from everyone. So don't be shy to add your questions. But we have a couple of comments already, and one of them relates to the OECD and another one to the AIB. And we have a third, more broader question about equality of opportunity. So let me say something about the OECD, because I was not really planning to say very much about it during the lectures, but it's an interesting example to look at. So the OECD is a sort of a form of club. So I suppose to some extent international organizations all are, because they can set the criteria for their membership. Now, in the case of international financial institutions, especially the major ones, so if you think of the World Bank, the EBRD, the Asian Development Bank, the AIIB, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, then they are generally open to most countries. So it's a generalization, but as a generalization, it's true that these organizations are open to most countries as members. And then there is a subgroup of those members who are able to benefit directly in terms of receiving financial support. So that's sort of the model of international financial institutions. Now, in the case of the OECD, it's not a financial institution, and it's not open to everyone. You have to, in order to be admitted as a member, you have to meet certain criteria, one of which is that you have to have demonstrated a certain level of commitment to certain liberal values, including democracy and open markets. So, and it's also really open only to those who have managed to achieve a sort of sustained level of development. So traditionally, it was often thought of as a rich person's club, but I think over the years it's become a bit more inclusive, but certainly not open to all countries around the world. But it's a very influential organization from a development perspective for various reasons. And one area where it's important, where its work is very important, is that it offers the secretariat for work that is done in the areas of addressing unfair tax practices. And this is a very topical issue, and it's one of particular relevance to developing countries as well as developed countries. And the work of the OECD is particularly important there. But generally, I've always thought of the OECD, like many international organizations, as providing leadership in the area of developing policy and being more than a think tank, but not providing the level of implementation that you would see at an international financial institution. So one of the great advantages, of course, of the international financial institutions is that they have money, so they can finance the development that they are promoting. So the other question was about the AIB, and we're going to be studying this in a bit more depth a little bit later on. And so I won't say more about that right now, but I will come back to some of these other questions a little bit later on in the course. So thank you again for those questions.
May I just
Please
add some question regarding I think the question about OECD. This is a very interesting issue. I think the OECD has a very important organization called the DAC, Development Assistance Committee or something like that, to some other policy making regarding ODA, Official Development Assistance, which is basically the bilateral assistance, including Japan and some advanced countries. Actually, the working together for making rules for the assistance for development, ODA, official assistance. So this kind of rules and the policies also followed by the AMD multiple financial institutions like AIB, also on the World Bank, or probably have such kind of a function. But because the point is, AIB is actually initiated by the China, and the China, as I understand, still is not a member of the OECD, because China itself claiming that this is not advanced countries, so developing countries, so no need to be followed this kind of policy or rules. So that is kind of some sort of frictions, especially for some other, advanced countries, including Japan and USA, or some sort of things. So any sort of a kind of a dialogue or kind of a sort of a pipe for the kind of a negotiation. Of course, China has also their own policy, but as most important country to support AIB, how. Of course, AIB is not naming as a development, but investment bank. But investment and also development is, I think, how this is all related. What is the point for the AIB is not development bank, or some sort of a similar as IFC or the World Bank is a kind of supporting investment to more growth, economic growth. So something like that, some part of the development paradigm, or some sort of a kind of a I'm very much interested if you can just respond. Really sorry for this.
No, I think it's a very important observation and a very important question. What I would say is that most of the considerations that you have touched on are relevant for China to determine its own national thinking about these issues. And in addition, it's like all members of the AIB will bring its thinking to the institution when the institution is setting strategies and policies. And indeed, it would have brought some of its thinking with it, as would other countries at the time when the AIB was being established and when a charter was being drafted. However, once you cross that line between promoting national interests over which you have total control and advancing national interests as part of a negotiation among other members, then what one sees is the international organization itself takes on a life of its own. And this is particularly true where the shareholding of the institution is very diversely held. And then what one sees is that the standards that are being promoted by the institution are much less recognizable as the national standards of any one member country, even a country with a lot of influence, such as China in the AIB, or Japan at the Asian Development Bank, or the United States at the World Bank. And so what emerges are really international standards that are not so different in broad terms from one international organization to the other. Now, one area where the AIB is quite interesting is that, unlike all the other organizations, the large organizations, the AIB uniquely is owned and controlled by the members that are expected to receive financial support. So if you look at, say, the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank, then those who make the rules, who have greatest influence on the rules, will not be receiving any of the financial support. But the AIIB is not like that at all. So the countries that own and control, that have majority ownership and majority control at the AIIB are also those who are borrowers and who are expected to be borrowers of the institution. And so there, the fear had been, and I think this was a fear that was expressed in Japanese policy circles, was that this would force a downward spiral in terms of standards. Because if you are a country wanting to borrow, then you don't want the standards to be too demanding on you. And because most of the countries can borrow from the AIIB, and because they control the organization, then the fear was that standards would be lowered. And this has, in fact, not transpired. This is not the case. This is not what has happened. So you have not seen the standards at the AIIB sort of replicate national standards for the kind of reasons that you mentioned, Professor Sato. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. It's one of the unique features of the AIIB, another reason why it's so interesting to study. But for now, I think we can just observe that even though it's owned and controlled by borrowing countries, the standards that the institution imposes have not been compromised at all. And rather than reflecting any national standard, they do reflect very much international standards of a sort that are not dissimilar to the other international organizations where the borrowing countries do not have control over the setting of strategies and policies. So with that, let me change tack a little bit now and talk about history. And I think the history is important because if one looks at the history of international organizations, then one can get a better understanding of why the multilateral financial institution landscape is as it is today. How did we get to where we are? So I would like to basically take everyone back to a very important year in the development of multilateral financial institutions, or as we tend to call them in modern parlance much more now, international financial institutions. And so the year that I would like everyone to reflect, well, not reflect back on, because none of us, not even Professor Sato and myself, were born in 1944. But it's an important year, and I want to encourage everyone to try and see if they can put themselves in the mindset that existed there, and to then reflect on how radically things were changing. And the reason for 1944 being so important is that that is the year of the Bretton Woods Conference. It's a conference that was held when the war was drawing to a close, and when most people on the planet were very much poorer than they are today. And we know that in the 75 years since Bretton Woods, there has been remarkable economic growth, and this has been underpinned by an historically very long period of uninterrupted relative peace in most parts of the world. So one of the reasons for the ensuing prosperity over the last 75 years, I would say, and we have to acknowledge that this prosperity has not always been shared equitably, but nonetheless, in terms of the economic growth that the world has enjoyed, is because nations have got much better at working together to further trade among themselves, and also to facilitate cross-border investment. And so this has called for a level of collaboration that can sometimes be best achieved by working through new institutions which are set up to help finance global commerce. And that indeed is what Bretton Woods was about. Bretton Woods gave rise to the International Monetary Fund, and it gave rise to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is the core part of what became the World Bank Group. So I may refer, as others do, to the IBRD and the World Bank somewhat interchangeably. But strictly speaking, the World Bank Group includes a number of divisions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Development Agency, the International Finance Corporation, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Association, and also the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. So altogether, those are part of the World Bank Group. But generally, when we talk about the World Bank, in terms of financing, we normally think of the IBRD, but also IDA and also the IFC. So this atmosphere of sustained political cooperation among many states in pursuit of shared economic interests, this has been a hallmark of the post-war period. And this is so, even though it's also been marked by a frequent lack of inclusivity, and that lack of inclusivity became much more pronounced as the Cold War unfolded, but it's much less so with the fall of the Berlin Wall a generation ago. So when in 1944, you'll recall that the Soviet Union was part of the Allies, and the United States was very much the dominant economic and political power in the world. In fact, it was said that the reason that the conference took place in the United States was that there was really no other country that was in a position to be able to offer such a conference. Such was the very sorry state of the world. So in 1944, the Soviet Union was one of the powers that looked like it would be victorious in the war. But the Soviet Union never became a member of the Bretton Woods institutions, even though it was there during the negotiations. Some of the countries that fell under Soviet influence were initially members. So, for example, Czechoslovakia and Poland, but progressively they withdrew from that institution. So for a long time during the Cold War, the World Bank in particular really only had as its members countries that were outside of the countries on the other side of the Berlin Wall. So, and then this changed when communism collapsed in Europe, and many of these countries then wanted to participate in the World Bank, particularly because they needed financing. So the spirit of international cooperation among states, it helps explain the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, namely the IMF and the IBRD. And it explains too, I think, the regional development banks and the many, many sub-regional international financial institutions which have become established in the years since. So it's all about cooperation of states. Now, none of this is to suggest that the earlier attempts at states working together to enhance foreign trade and investment didn't amount to anything. Indeed, some of the earliest recorded history of interstate relations, from Mesopotamia in the West to China in the East, is about trade. And in more recent history, the groups of states have surrendered parts of their sovereignty in order to work together to achieve some economic objective. And the participation in the IMF, as we will see, was about surrendering parts of countries' sovereignty. But this was not unprecedented. So for instance, in the early 19th century, before the unification of Germany, independent German states established a customs union, which was called the Zollverein. This is spelled Z-O-L-L-V-E-R-E-I-N. V-E-R-E-I-N. Even the doomed League of Nations, a casualty of the war it had failed to prevent, can claim to have fostered positive economic outcomes, given its contribution to securing, albeit in a limited way, the peace on which commerce is predicated. So those decisions of the Permanent Court of Justice, which constitute peaceful means of resolving territorial disputes, they attest to this. So the idea of countries collaborating did exist prior to 1944, and prior to 1944, countries did collaborate in ways that included a suspension of their own sovereignty. Similarly, the notion and the whole enterprise of international development is not something that was invented in 1944. So it existed long before then, even if maybe the stated objectives of the few international organizations that did exist, they were not couched in development language that we're familiar with. However, if you look at their purposes, then I think we can understand that they were really supporting development as we would understand it, to support the furtherance of prosperity, for example, even though that may not have been the language that was used by those early international organizations. And the international organizations have been around for a long time. I believe, there is some debate about this, but I believe that the oldest international organization is one that was founded in 1815, and that was founded as part of the Congress of Vienna, which was convened after the defeat of Napoleon, when the whole map of Europe was being redrawn. And that new international organization, which still exists, by the way, is called the Central Commission for the Navigation of the Rhine. And the CCNR, as it's known, it still promotes European prosperity by ensuring secure navigation along one of Europe's most economically important rivers, which runs through many states. So recapping then, before 1944, there were also innumerable bilateral efforts in development. So we can look around the corner in Japan, in fact, where we all are, at least physically, or through the magic of technology. Now, at the time of the Meiji Restoration, as you all know much better than me, Japan looked to Europe to provide a model for a new civil code. And Germany provided what we would today call technical assistance, offering its own experience as one to be modeled by Japan. And this explains why the Japanese civil code of today, which was first adopted, I believe, in 1896, is essentially Germanic in design. Interestingly, because of the long influence of Japan in Taiwan, the civil code there is also inspired by that of Germany. Or if we look further afield, if we look at Turkey, when it was seeking to modernize its economy after the establishment of the Republic, after the collapse of the Ottoman period, it looked to other countries to adopt a civil code, and it adopted that of Switzerland. So the civil code you see today in Turkey is modeled on Switzerland. So these examples, they highlight how transportable law is in the field of development assistance. And outside of the narrow area of legislative drafting of this legal technical assistance, I think it's also true that even legal and political philosophy, which was born in one part of the world, it can transport itself to other parts of the world, and it can become very prosperous there. So an example one could look at is for the Germans. If there are any German students here, you will know about Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was a Prussian linguist and a government functionary. That's what he was known for in Germany. but he used to spend his evenings scribbling down some philosophical thoughts. And these philosophical thoughts were picked up by someone who was working in England, whose name was John Stuart Mill in the 18th century. And he wrote, along with Harriet Taylor, not always fully recognized, his seminal work On Liberty. That's the name of his book. Many of you will be familiar with that, On Liberty. And today, Mill is probably not that well known in the United Kingdom, but he's much better known in the United States. And so it's reported that United States Supreme Court constitutional law decisions, they cite On Liberty more than any other philosophical text. So it's interesting that you have someone just thinking about some political and philosophical and legal issues in Germany, whose ideas are picked up by someone in England, and whose book is then very influential in the United States. So this law is very, very transportable. And so many of the ideas that set up and support international organizations and international financial institutions, they're also very transportable in the same way. It doesn't really matter so much where an international organization is located. The ideas that influence it can be truly universal. So let me say a few words more specifically about the creation of the IMF and the World Bank. So as we have seen, when the two new institutions were agreed upon at the Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States in the summer of 1944, at that moment in time, the world had already an experience of states operating alone or working with other states in order to foster development, as we would understand that. By the way, at Bretton Woods, there was also a third institution that was envisaged. So in addition to regulating exchange rates, which was the idea of the IMF, or to finance reconstruction and development, which was the purpose of the IBRD, it was envisaged too that there would be another institution that would sponsor global trade. But this initiative actually failed, ultimately because the United States Senate was not supportive of it. However, I think it took probably about another 50 years when during the Uruguay round on trade, an agreement was reached to establish the World Trade Organization. But going back to Bretton Woods, so at that time, we've noted that even in 1944, there were existing international organizations in existence, and some of them were pursuing goals that we would understand today as being development. And also quite settled at the time was the idea of building on the legal experience of others. For example, the technical assistance that was provided by one state to another, or the legal philosophies or political philosophies adopted by one state, even though they were borrowed from other states. So all of these things existed, and they're very important, and it's important to acknowledge them. But nonetheless, the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in 1944, they really represented a watershed moment in the international community committing itself politically and legally to pursuing a common economic enterprise. So there had never been before such an ambitious attempt to promote international monetary cooperation, which was the concern of the IMF. And by the way, that's an objective which involved member countries agreeing to be treaty bound to suspend their sovereign right to set their own exchange rates. So to become a member of the IMF, you had to agree that you would no longer have control over something that you always had a sovereign right to control, namely the setting of your own exchange rates. So quite an innovation. And if you look at the available record at Bretton Woods, and it was quite thin, by the way, it's very different from what you would see for an international conference today. It seems that 95% of all the discussion and the debate was about the IMF. And there was very little about the World Bank. So I think it would be an exaggeration to say that the creation of the IBRD was an afterthought, but it certainly attracted much less controversy. And I think part of the reason it was less controversial is because by becoming a member of the World Bank, countries were not being asked to forego any sovereign right at all. They were simply being given the opportunity, if they were a developing country, to borrow from the World Bank. There was no obligation to do that, but they would have the ability to do that. So it was much less controversial. And so there was really no downside to joining the World Bank. But for those who were putting together the IMF, they decided that it would be sensible to make membership of the IMF a precondition to becoming a member of the World Bank. So countries couldn't decide just to borrow from the World Bank, but then to continue having control over their exchange rates. They were required to suspend their sovereign right to set their own exchange rates, which is what happens when you join the IMF, or what happened at the time when one joined the IMF. And having joined the IMF, they could then join the World Bank, where they would then be able to borrow if they were a borrowing country. So that was the bargain, and it was a fairly popular bargain. So let me address a slightly different issue now, which is about the specialized agency status of the IMF and the World Bank. And I think this is important because there are a number of multilateral financial institutions today which are specialized agencies of the UN. And it's interesting that the IMF and the World Bank are both specialized agencies of the UN, even though when they were created, the UN had yet to come into existence. But once the UN was formally created, then the two institutions very swiftly became specialized agencies. In fact, it's quite interesting that the Bretton Woods Conference, the full title of it is the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. And so that was the title in 1944 of that conference, even though there was no United Nations then. But nonetheless, the conference was called the UN Conference. But I think that the groundswell of support at the time for the creation of new global bodies to help solve the problems of the world and to rebuild the post-war era was such that no one focused too much on those little niceties. But I mentioned all of this. I mentioned the IMF in particular, so that one can understand how the World Bank Group came about and why membership of the two institutions is linked in the way it is, and why both organizations are specialized agencies of the United Nations. But I don't want to say much more about the IMF, either today or for the remainder of the course, because even though clearly it is an institution and it's financial and it's international, it doesn't really fit the classic sort of mold of multilateral financial institutions, namely those international organizations which are concerned with financing specific development projects or specific programs supporting development. The IMF is much more interested if it does make loans, but when it does that, it's really to help countries address balance of payment difficulties. So it's a very important institution and it's worthy of study in its own right. But our focus for the remainder of these lectures will be in the more classic multilateral financial institutions. And here you should think in the mold of global organizations, such as the World Bank groups, in particular, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Development Agency, and the International Finance Corporation. You should think also in terms of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And then you should think about the major regional development banks, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And you should think also about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So the AIB, it's a bit unusual. It is in some sense a global bank because it's just by virtue of the sheer number of members which continue to grow. So it has members on every continent. And it is also able to invest in any member, and exceptionally, it could invest in a non-member in certain circumstances and following certain governance rules. But the purpose, so in that sense, it's global, but the purpose of the institution is to enhance connectivity, promote growth, foster development in Asia, very expensively defined. So in that sense, it's regional. So it's a little bit of a hybrid of a regional and global organization. But what I would ask you to take away from all of this now is that Bretton Woods was really the watershed moment for the development of international financial institutions. The IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, is the first of all the international financial institutions. And it's really the progenitor of the regional development banks, and to a lesser extent, the sub-regional development banks that have followed in the subsequent 75 years. So I'd like to just pause there for a moment. I know that's a lot for everybody to take in, but maybe I can invite everyone just to reflect for a few minutes and maybe to share some comments in the chat. And I think, again, there's no golden rule here. Just share your thoughts. If you have an observation to make, or you would like to agree or disagree with something that's been said, or you have a question, the chat function is available to accommodate all of these considerations. So thank you to those who have posted comments or observations on the chat function. So others who haven't done that, please do that. This will be very useful for when we consider the future lectures. Let me try and respond to a couple of these. So I think there was a question, a couple of comments with regard to the IMF, and some of those who posted comments have observed that the conditionality imposed by the IMF has sometimes been controversial. So this is actually a fascinating subject. If you look at the charter of the IMF, and if you look at some of the documents surrounding its establishment, and if you look at some of the earliest decisions that were made by some of the governance bodies, you could make the argument that conditionality was not something that was expressly envisaged by those who put the system in place. And for those who object to conditionality, sometimes that is an argument that is raised by them, and others argue about the nature of the conditionality. But there is a conceptual objection that is raised by some to the whole notion of any kind of conditionality. So their argument is that if countries get themselves into trouble for whatever reason, then they can look to the IMF for support. Now, over time, it was felt that if countries are going to be seeking support, then the institution needed to be comfortable that they were not throwing good money after bad, that things would change if there was some systemic problem that was giving rise to the need for having to come back to the IMF for further support. Then something ought to change so that the likelihood of further requests for support would be reduced. And that was really what sort of explained the start of conditionality being imposed. Then the nature of this conditionality evolved over time, but the sort of high watermark really occurred, I guess, in the 1990s, when there was this confluence of thinking at the International Monetary Fund and at the World Bank and in the Treasury Department of the United States government. And the United States is very influential at the IMF and at the World Bank, as you know. And so there was this moment, really the decade of the 90s, where all three institutions had a common view of what it was that countries had to do in order to get their economic structures right, so that they would be more economically and financially sustainable, and therefore much less likely to be reliant on the IMF for future support. So that became known as the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus held sway for quite a few years, and I think it's not a term that's used today, and it certainly has its critics. So I think it really gets us very deeply into the realm of economics to know what are the right economic prescriptions for countries. Probably there's no one economic prescription. It probably has to be tailored for each country to reflect each country's particular circumstances. And what's important, of course, is that the country itself should be able to have a real influence in being able to design the kind of conditionality that would be appropriate, because as you can see, this goes very much towards sovereignty. But I would say that the reality is that if countries are sovereign and they can decide, for example, on the size of the state and the economy, or the extent of support for social programs like education and health, welfare. Nonetheless, if you're dependent on someone providing support, and remember the IMF, it's really a lender of last resort, then the reality is that that those countries have to be prepared for conditions being attached to further lending. Again, that conceptual argument about there shouldn't be any conditionality, I think it remains as valid today as it ever did. But if there are to be conditions, then what the right conditions are is a very difficult question. And I think that the IMF has come under a lot of criticism for the kind of conditions that's sometimes imposed, but it's a bit of a hopeless case, because it's an awful predicament to be in if you are responsible for preserving the collective capital of all of the members, and yet you want to support a country that is not operating in a sustainable way, then it's not an attractive position for the IMF to insist, for example, on the cutting of social programs, because there are real human consequences and immediate human consequences to cutting back on, say, things like health. But equally, if the capital of the collective membership is weakened, then that does not do the interests of the collective membership any good either. So it is a very difficult predicament, I think, for the IMF to be in. So do other international financial institutions have this kind of conditionality? And that was one of the questions. So I would say the answer is no, not in the same way. Certainly for most development lending, the issue doesn't arise because it's really specific projects that are being financed or specific programs of projects that are being financed. So in the case of the AIB, which is where one of the questions was directed, then when the AIB makes a loan in the private sector, which by the end of this decade will account for half of the AIB's work, then the possibility of imposing any kind of conditions on the state just doesn't exist, because the role of the state in those private sector investments is very limited, and it's really largely confined to agreeing that a project should take place on its territory that is being financed by the international organization. Where the project being financed involves a loan to the state or a guarantee to the state, then usually it is specific projects, specific infrastructure projects that are being financed. So there are conditions attached to the project, but there are not sort of macro conditions attached broadly to the running of the economy. So as an example, if the AIB is financing the development of a railway line and the financing of track and tunnels in a country, or from one country to another, or through several countries, then the conditionality that is imposed may extend to requiring that there be a modern railway law that very clearly sets out the responsibilities regarding who has to maintain the track and the tunnels, and who is able to have their rolling stock and their trains running along those tracks, and how competition should be regulated and so forth. So that aspect of conditionality does exist, but there is no conditionality there that relates to what the country generally should do. I would say the closest that the AIB has got to this is in the last year. Quite a lot of the work of the AIB has been focused on assisting the poorest countries who have been hardest hit by the COVID pandemic to cope. And so here there has been fast dispersing loans that have been made, always, in fact, in tandem with the World Bank or with the Asian Development Bank. And the reason for that is that the AIB does not have very much experience in this, so it wants to work with other organizations. And so it has been doing that. It's provided a lot of support in this area. And here the loans are directly to the state. They are dispersed very quickly, and the state really has freedom to use the money as it sees fit to preserve the existing infrastructure, to protect it, to preserve the productive capacity of the country, which of course includes the labor force. So in those instances, there are no specific conditions. There's no conditionality of the sort that one would see at the IMF. I suppose there could be certain kinds of conditions regarding how the health sector ought to be organized and regulated. But the AIB has not done that because its expertise in the health sector is still being built, and it doesn't feel, and it certainly wouldn't feel confident to do that, even if it were appropriate to do that. So in the case of the AIB, it does not impose that kind of conditionality, even in the case of COVID. And I believe the same is true for the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank as well. I don't know about the other institutions, but I suspect the situation is the same. So there was a series of questions then with regarding the IMF and conditionality, and I hope that helped answer them. There was another question about the specific mechanisms for IFIs interacting with sovereign countries, and these do exist, and they are really pivotal to international financial institutions being able to operate. So the institutions have their own capital, so the members have contributed capital, so there's an interaction there. The members also vote for the members on the board of governors and for the members of the board of directors. These are the people who set the strategies. These are the people who set the policies. And even though they do have an obligation to act in the best interests of the institution, they also have a dual obligation to act in the best interests of the countries who they represent. So it's an unusual governance notion, but this is how it works for the international financial institutions. So there's constant interaction in that way. There are also limits to how much the institutions can finance, relying solely on their own capital. So it's important to borrow in the capital markets, and to do that, the international organizations have to engage with members in order to raise funds, sometimes also with non-members. So in the case of the AIB, the first borrowing was in the United States, the global program, a global fund, so a global bond rather. So the United States is not a member of the AIB, but the AIB has engaged a national state in order to raise funds, and of course it's raising funds in member states as well. And another way in which the AIB engages with states in the funding area is it works very closely with commercial banks. So when it's financing projects in the private sector, the AIB will usually only finance a minority portion of the project, but it will try and mobilize co-financing from other commercial banks, both locally and internationally. And one of the ways it's able to do that, to raise funds internationally, is by being able to enable those commercial banks usually, or they could also be funds or pension funds or other kinds of commercial lenders, to benefit from their association with the AIB. And one very specific way in which that happens, which we will talk about at a later lecture, is by sharing some, or enabling those co-financiers to benefit from some of the privileged situations in which the AIB has found itself as a result of agreement by the members as a whole. So the AIB will enjoy tax immunities, the AIB will be exempt from any kind of moratoria and so forth. And through some careful structuring, the benefits of this can be extended to commercial banks in some circumstances, and that is how the international financial institutions are able to mobilize co-financing to support projects in especially difficult countries where international commercial banks would not normally venture. So I hope that answers some of those questions. There are a few others, and we could pick up on those in the next class. But here I see we have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to hand back to Professor Sato
Okay.
To conclude the session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gerard. It's an excellent presentation as introduction to this today, and let's keep on continuing for the discussion. In fact, I wanted to ask you the specific about the law of the General Council. Curious on what's the governing law of basically the AIB using, because we are as a colleague in the EBRD is basically English law or New York law as a private for the contract. Of course, international law is also such a choice, but international law, as you know, not codified yet. So in this sense, commercial contract, any sort of national law should be also applicable. So in this sense, aside from this issue of the conditionalities, this kind of matter of the law govern is also key for any things. But maybe keeping continuing the discussion about next class. It's next class is Thursday, 4th, same time, and one announcement to you, Gerald is kindly offered to us some sort of a public seminar even after the course, because as a visiting professor, he should be also responsible for any sort of guidance to the students, not only the course, but also for a career path or sort of thing. So if you're interested in IB or IFA, any such things, or this seminar should be planning on the 8th of March, maybe evening time in Japan time, 6 to 8 p.m. probably. We are discussing a topic. Topic could be broad, for instance, SDGs and AIB or something like that. SDGs, that's UN sort of a kind of a goals for every state, people's sustainability goals. So how the AIB is working for this kind of a common agenda for the global context and so on. Anyway, thank you very much, and please join us. And one more, maybe I forgot to introduce the staff. Lauren as this is the teaching assistant, TA, and Haruki is a kind of a class supporter in case you have any technical issues. And I think presentation materials should be available and uploaded by him to the Google group, I think. Any announcement, Haruki and also Lauren, if you want to introduce yourself, also Yuri, Takeuchi, and also the Satoko Haru for the support of this course. Anyone?
Also, we made a mailing list, and we chatted about it. And if you don't join this mailing list, please register here. That's it.
Okay. All right. Any sort of questions now? And also I tried to upload this materials, the PowerPoint file, the ITCLMS, but I cannot promise you because it's a bit complicated because he cannot control the ITCLMS. I have to do that, but I'm sometimes too busy to do that. So Haruki will just upload it to the Google group. So maybe it's more convenient to you, probably. Anyway, as I said, there's a technical issues, also any sort of class organizations. We are, kind of a trial error. It's up to you how to do organizing for feedback. Don't hesitate to any claim and criticism or any opinions, questions, and even after the class, we are always keep in touch always. And Gerald, as you may know, also Dr. Gao is quite friendly and always very much responsible. Thank you very much, both of you, for participation. And everyone, thank you very much. So, see you.